The Roman Empire is often seen as one of the greatest civilizations in history, a powerful force that dominated much of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East for centuries. But the story of Rome's rise is as much about struggle, innovation, and adaptation as it is about conquest and empire building. Rome began not as an empire, but as a small city-state in central Italy, founded in 753 BCE according to legend, by Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf. From its humble beginnings, Rome would grow to become the center of a sprawling empire that changed the course of history. At first, Rome was a republic, governed by elected officials and guided by the Senate, which represented the aristocracy. The Roman Republic was founded in 509 BCE after the overthrow of the last Roman king, Tarquin the Proud, marking the end of monarchy and the beginning of a system of governance based on shared power between the Senate and popular assemblies. For several centuries, the Roman Republic flourished, expanding its territory and influence through a combination of military conquest, strategic alliances, and internal reforms. Roman society was divided into two main classes: the patricians, the wealthy aristocracy, and the plebeians, the common people. Tensions between these classes were common, but over time, plebeians gained more political power through reforms like the election of tribunes, who represented the interests of the common people. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had begun to extend its influence over the Mediterranean world. The Punic Wars, fought between Rome and the powerful city-state of Carthage, were pivotal in establishing Roman dominance. The second of these wars, the Second Punic War, 218–201 BCE, saw the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal march his army, including war elephants, across the Alps to invade Italy. Despite early successes, Hannibal was ultimately defeated, and Rome emerged as the undisputed power in the Mediterranean. With the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, Rome solidified its position as a Mediterranean superpower. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's military success and territorial expansion had led to the concentration of power in the hands of a few influential generals, such as Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, who formed the First Triumvirate. This political alliance, while initially successful, eventually fractured, leading to civil war. Julius Caesar, after years of military campaigns, notably in Gaul, modern-day France, emerged victorious. In 49 BCE, Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon River with his army, defying the Senate and initiating a civil war. After defeating Pompey and his supporters, Caesar declared himself dictator for life in 44 BCE, signaling the end of the Roman Republic. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, at the hands of a group of senators who feared his growing power, did not restore the Republic. Instead, it led to another round of civil wars. Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian, later known as Augustus, ultimately triumphed over his rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's victory marked the beginning of the Roman Empire. In 27 BCE, the Senate awarded Octavian the title Augustus, making him the first emperor of Rome. The transformation from republic to empire was complete. Augustus established a period of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, which lasted for over 2 centuries. The Roman Empire, under Augustus and his successors, would expand its borders, build monumental structures, and make enduring contributions to law, architecture, and governance. Rome became the center of a vast empire, stretching from the British Isles in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, and from the Danube River in the north to Egypt in the south. At its peak, the Roman Empire was a political and military juggernaut, holding sway over much of the known world. But how long could such an empire endure? Would the strength and unity of Rome be able to withstand the pressures of internal corruption, economic strain, and external invasions? Could the Roman Empire remain the dominant force in the Mediterranean, or would time and circumstance lead to its eventual decline? The Roman Empire, under the reign of Augustus and his successors, entered what is often regarded as its golden age. During this period, from the late 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE, the empire achieved unprecedented military success, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Rome's borders expanded, its infrastructure was enhanced, and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, provided stability for the empire's vast territories. The Pax Romana, peace and prosperity. One of the hallmarks of the Golden Age was the relative peace and stability that Augustus and his successors were able to maintain across the empire. The Pax Romana allowed trade to flourish, cities to grow, and Roman culture to spread. Roman roads, which spanned the empire from Britain to the Middle East, connected distant provinces and facilitated communication, transportation, and military movement. The empire's vast network of roads was so well built that many of them are still in use today. Agriculture thrived, with the empire's fertile lands producing abundant crops, and Roman infrastructure, including aqueducts and baths, helped improve the lives of millions of citizens. Roman architecture reached new heights during this time, with monumental buildings such as the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the aqueducts symbolizing the might and ingenuity of Rome. The empire also saw significant advancements in law, with the development of the Roman legal code, which would influence legal systems throughout the world for centuries to come. The emperors who succeeded Augustus, including Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, and others, continued to strengthen the empire's institutions, although their reigns varied in quality. Some emperors were capable leaders, ensuring the empire's stability, while others, like Nero, were infamous for their extravagance, cruelty, and mismanagement. Economic prosperity and military dominance. The Roman economy flourished during the Golden Age, and trade with both the East and the West expanded. Roman merchants traded in luxury goods, such as silk from China, spices from India, and gold and silver from Africa. The empire's vast territorial holdings allowed for the exploitation of resources, including precious metals, grain, and timber, and its dominance over the Mediterranean meant that Roman ships controlled much of the sea trade. The Roman military, too, was at the height of its power. The Roman legions, which had undergone reforms under Augustus, were now a well-trained, professional fighting force. The Roman army was crucial to the expansion of the empire, and Roman soldiers were stationed across the empire's frontiers to defend its borders against external threats. During this period, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, with Roman control stretching from the British Isles in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, and from the Danube River in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. Roman legions were effective not just because of their training and discipline, but also because of their strategic use of fortifications and military engineering. Roman soldiers built roads, bridges, and forts, ensuring that the empire's vast territories were well connected and well defended. This military dominance, along with Roman diplomacy and the ability to absorb conquered peoples into the empire, kept the Roman borders secure for centuries. The seeds of decline, internal strains, and political instability. However, even at the height of its power, the Roman Empire was not without its challenges. The very success of the empire sowed the seeds of its eventual decline. As the empire expanded, the costs of maintaining it grew. The military demands of securing such a vast territory were immense, and the government was increasingly burdened with the need to fund the army, maintain infrastructure, and manage its diverse provinces. Moreover, the political system of the empire was unstable. While the first few emperors after Augustus managed the empire with relative efficiency, the later years saw the rise of incompetent, corrupt, and sometimes downright tyrannical emperors. Some emperors, like Caligula and Nero, were infamous for their cruelty and excess, while others were seen as weak or incapable of managing the empire's vast bureaucracy. This political instability created factions within the ruling elite and led to power struggles that weakened the central authority of the emperor. The Roman Empire's transition from a republic to an autocracy had also led to a gradual erosion of the power of the Senate. While the Senate still held some authority, it became increasingly irrelevant as the emperor's power grew. This shift in governance contributed to internal tensions between the emperor and the elite class, weakening the ability of the state to respond to internal and external threats effectively. Social inequality and economic strain. The prosperity of the Roman Empire was not shared equally. While the aristocracy and the military elite enjoyed immense wealth, the majority of the population lived in poverty. Slavery was widespread, and much of the labor that supported the empire's economy was provided by enslaved peoples. In the cities, the poor lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, while the wealthy resided in luxurious villas and palaces. The disparity between the rich and the poor fueled social tensions, and over time, the inability of the empire to address these inequalities eroded its social cohesion. At the same time, the empire faced an increasing economic burden. The constant need for military spending drained the state's resources, and heavy taxation was imposed on the provinces to support the empire's infrastructure. While trade continued to thrive, inflation began to take hold, and the Roman currency lost its value. The economic strain became even more acute during periods of civil war or military revolt, when the state's resources were diverted away from commerce and industry to fund internal conflicts. The impact of external threats. While the empire was still at the height of its power, external threats began to increase. In the 3rd century CE, Rome faced invasions from several barbarian groups, including the Goths, Vandals, and Huns. These groups, often fleeing from other migrating tribes, began to push into Roman territory. The Romans struggled to defend their borders, and many of the empire's resources were stretched thin trying to fend off these incursions. The empire's response to these threats was inconsistent. In some cases, Roman generals and commanders were able to stave off invasions, while in others, the empire lost territory. The Romans were also forced to rely on barbarian mercenaries to defend the empire, which had long-term consequences. These mercenaries, while effective in battle, often had their own allegiances and sometimes turned against the empire. By the 5th century, barbarian groups such as the Visigoths and Vandals had sacked major Roman cities, including Rome itself in 410 CE and 455 CE. The continued pressure from outside invaders, combined with internal political and economic instability, created the perfect storm for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. In 476 CE, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, marking the official end of the Western Roman Empire. While the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly another 1,000 years, the fall of the West was a momentous event that marked the end of the ancient Roman world. Though the Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 CE, the legacy of Rome has endured for centuries, leaving a profound impact on the course of world history. The cultural, political, and intellectual contributions of Rome have shaped the development of Western civilization and continue to resonate today. From the structure of modern governments to the foundations of law, art, architecture, and language, the influence of the Roman Empire can be seen in countless aspects of our lives. Roman law, the foundation of Western legal systems. One of the most enduring legacies of the Roman Empire is its legal system. Roman law, with its principles of justice, property rights, and civil liberties, became the foundation for many modern legal systems, particularly in Europe and the Americas. The Roman legal code, codified in the 12 Tables and later expanded through the Corpus Juris Civilis under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, emphasized the importance of written law and equal treatment before the law. Roman law introduced key concepts like due process, habeas corpus, contract law, and private property. The idea that a person was innocent until proven guilty, and the concept of legal representation in court also originated in Roman times. These principles would later be adopted and refined in the legal systems of many modern nations, especially in the development of European and American law. The influence of Roman law can be seen in the legal codes of modern countries, many of which are rooted in Roman legal traditions. In fact, civil law systems, used in countries like France, Germany, and Spain, are directly derived from Roman law, and its principles continue to serve as a blueprint for contemporary legal practices. Roman architecture and engineering, the foundations of modern infrastructure. Roman architecture and engineering were groundbreaking and continue to influence the design and construction of modern infrastructure. The Romans were master builders, constructing enduring structures that were not only functional but also awe-inspiring. Their use of arches, domes, and concrete revolutionized building techniques and allowed them to create vast, durable structures like aqueducts, roads, bridges, and amphitheaters. Perhaps the most famous Roman architectural achievement is the Colosseum in Rome, an iconic symbol of the empire's grandeur. The Romans also perfected the use of the arch, allowing them to build larger and more stable structures. Roman aqueducts, which brought fresh water to cities, are a testament to their advanced engineering skills. The extensive network of Roman roads, some of which still exist today, facilitated the movement of armies, trade, and communication across the empire. The Romans' innovations in architecture and engineering provided the blueprint for many of the cities and structures that would be built in the centuries to come. From the design of modern stadiums to the construction of bridges, aqueducts, and government buildings, the influence of Roman architecture is unmistakable. Many modern cities owe their design and functionality to Roman principles of urban planning and infrastructure. The Roman language and literature, the spread of Latin. Another significant aspect of Rome's legacy is its language. Latin, the language of the Romans, became the lingua franca of the Western world for centuries. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, Latin remained the language of scholarship, religion, and administration throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The Catholic Church, in particular, used Latin as its official language for centuries, preserving its influence in Western culture. The spread of Latin also had a lasting impact on the development of European languages. Romance languages like Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are direct descendants of Latin. Latin vocabulary and grammar also heavily influenced the development of the English language, especially in terms of legal, scientific, and academic terminology. Roman literature, too, has had a lasting impact. Works by authors like Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, and Horace have continued to shape Western literary traditions. The Aeneid, for instance, became a foundational epic in the study of classical literature. Roman historians such as Tacitus and Livy provided valuable insights into the workings of power, politics, and military strategy, influencing generations of historians and political thinkers. Roman philosophy and the birth of Western thought. Roman thinkers, particularly during the time of the Roman Empire, contributed significantly to the development of Western philosophy. While much of Roman philosophy was influenced by Greek thought, it laid the groundwork for later intellectual movements, including the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, the latter being a Roman emperor as well, promoted Stoicism, a philosophy that emphasized virtue, wisdom, and self-control. Stoicism had a profound impact on later philosophical thought, especially in the development of moral philosophy and the concept of personal responsibility. Roman law, ethics, and politics were also deeply intertwined with philosophical ideas. The Roman Republic's emphasis on civic duty and participation in government, though later eroded by imperial rule, remained a touchstone for later thinkers such as Machiavelli and Rousseau, who would draw from Rome's experiences to develop their own political theories. The Roman influence on Christianity and religion. Christianity, which emerged during the Roman Empire, is perhaps the most significant religious legacy of Rome. While the early Christians were persecuted by Roman authorities, the eventual adoption of Christianity as the state religion by Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century CE transformed the religious landscape of Europe and the Western world. The Roman Empire's adoption of Christianity paved the way for the spread of the faith throughout Europe and beyond. The Church, as a central institution of Roman society, retained much of the organizational structure of the empire itself. The concept of a universal faith and the hierarchical structure of the Church mirrored the Roman system of governance, which emphasized order and unity under a single authority. The rise of Christianity also marked the beginning of the transition from the polytheistic religions of the ancient world to the monotheistic religions that would dominate the Western world in the centuries to come. The Christian Church became an enduring institution that influenced art, culture, politics, and social structures throughout Europe and the Americas. The fall of Rome and the transition to the Byzantine Empire. While the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, its eastern counterpart, the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for nearly 1,000 years, with Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, as its capital. The Byzantine Empire preserved many elements of Roman culture, law, and governance, and it played a crucial role in preserving classical knowledge and transmitting it to the Islamic world and later to Europe during the Renaissance. The Byzantine Empire's survival also ensured that the legacy of Rome lived on through the Middle Ages and beyond. Roman law, Christian theology, and Greek and Roman knowledge were preserved and carried forward by the Byzantine scholars and the Orthodox Church, ensuring that the intellectual contributions of Rome were not lost. Conclusion: Rome's enduring legacy. The Roman Empire may have collapsed, but its legacy has lived on in nearly every aspect of modern life. From the principles of law and governance to the art and architecture that adorn cities around the world, from the language spoken by millions to the religious ideas that shape the Western world, Rome's influence remains undeniable. Rome's story, from its humble beginnings as a small city-state to its rise as the most powerful empire in history, and its eventual fall, provides a profound lesson in the complexities of empire, power, and human nature. It serves as a reminder of both the greatness and fragility of civilizations, and its legacy continues to shape the world we live in today. The Cold War, a conflict that spanned over 4 decades, was not a traditional war fought with battles and direct confrontations. Instead, it was a global ideological struggle between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The conflict was defined by political, military, economic, and ideological rivalry, along with espionage, proxy wars, and nuclear arms races. The Cold War was rooted in the aftermath of World War II, a war that had reshaped the world and left Europe and Asia in ruins. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Allies, mainly the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, had worked together to defeat Nazi Germany and its allies. However, underlying tensions between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union had already begun to surface during the war. The differences in their political systems and ideologies became increasingly apparent once the common enemy was defeated. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, had emerged from the war as one of the most powerful nations in the world. Stalin's regime, rooted in communist ideology, sought to spread communism and expand Soviet influence across Europe and beyond. The United States, on the other hand, had emerged as the other global superpower. The U.S. championed democratic values and capitalist economics and sought to contain the spread of communism. The two nations had starkly different visions for the future of the world, and the power vacuum left by the collapse of Nazi Germany created an environment ripe for confrontation. The division of Germany after the war became one of the first flashpoints of the Cold War. Germany was split into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the US, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. The city of Berlin, deep within the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. Tensions escalated as the Soviets sought to consolidate their control over Eastern Europe, and the US and its allies tried to rebuild the western part of Europe. In 1947, the US responded to Soviet actions in Europe with the Truman Doctrine, which pledged to support countries threatened by communism. This was followed by the Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid to Western Europe to help rebuild economies devastated by the war and to prevent the spread of communism. In response, Stalin tightened his grip on Eastern Europe, turning countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary into satellite states of the Soviet Union. The Berlin blockade of 1948–49, in which the Soviets attempted to cut off West Berlin from the Western Allies, was one of the earliest and most dramatic moments of tension between the superpowers. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, sending supplies to West Berlin by air for almost a year, until Stalin lifted the blockade. As tensions mounted, the world found itself divided into 2 rival blocs, the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. The ideological divide between these 2 superpowers set the stage for the Cold War, a period characterized by political, military, and ideological confrontation. The Cold War was not just about military power, it was about ideas. The US saw itself as the defender of freedom, democracy, and capitalism, while the Soviet Union viewed itself as the protector of the working class and the spreader of communist ideals. The struggle between these 2 systems would have profound consequences for global politics, leading to proxy wars, arms races, and espionage. But how far would the conflict go? Would it escalate into a direct military confrontation between the 2 superpowers, or could the Cold War remain a war by other means, fought through proxy conflicts, economic influence, and ideological competition? As the Cold War progressed, the ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified. The 2 superpowers engaged in a global struggle for influence, which was fought not directly against each other but through proxy wars, political maneuvering, economic assistance, and, of course, the fear of nuclear conflict. The Cold War spanned continents, from Europe to Asia, Africa to Latin America, with each side trying to expand its ideological influence in the post-World War II world. The Korean War, the first hot conflict of the Cold War. One of the first major flashpoints of the Cold War occurred in 1950, when the Korean peninsula became the site of a brutal proxy war between the Communist North, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and the capitalist South, supported by the United States and the United Nations. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel after World War II, with the Soviet Union occupying the North and the United States occupying the South. The split was intended to be temporary, but the growing tensions between the superpowers turned the division into a lasting conflict. In 1950, North Korean forces, led by Kim Il-sung, launched an invasion of South Korea, quickly capturing Seoul and pushing South Korean forces to the brink of defeat. The United Nations, led by the United States, intervened, sending a multinational force to defend South Korea. The war quickly escalated into a bloody conflict with massive casualties on both sides. After initial successes by UN forces, the intervention of Chinese troops on behalf of North Korea in late 1950 turned the tide, leading to a prolonged stalemate. By 1953, an armistice agreement was signed, effectively ending the conflict, though no formal peace treaty was ever signed. The Korean War left Korea divided at the 38th parallel, a division that remains to this day. The Korean War was a clear demonstration of the global nature of the Cold War, where local conflicts were heavily influenced by the interests and interventions of the superpowers. The war reinforced the division of the world into two ideological camps and highlighted the potential for localized conflicts to escalate into larger, more destructive wars. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the brink of nuclear war. By the early 1960s, the Cold War was reaching its peak. One of the most dangerous confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union occurred in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The backdrop to the crisis was the rise of Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba after his 1959 revolution, which had overthrown the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union angered the United States, which saw the proximity of a communist government in the Western Hemisphere as a direct threat to its influence. In response to the U.S. placing missiles in Turkey and Italy, which were within range of the Soviet Union, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly arranged to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When American reconnaissance flights discovered the missile sites in October 1962, the U.S. government, led by President John F. Kennedy, faced a crisis. The prospect of nuclear war became very real. Kennedy responded by demanding the removal of the missiles and imposing a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment. For several tense days, the world watched as both sides stood at the brink of nuclear conflict. Fortunately, after intense negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island and the secret removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked the closest the world came to nuclear war during the Cold War, and it highlighted the extreme dangers of the nuclear arms race. The arms race, the threat of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis was part of a broader arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union that defined much of the Cold War. Both superpowers developed and stockpiled nuclear weapons in ever-increasing numbers. The fear of nuclear war loomed large throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as both the U.S. and the USSR developed new and more powerful weapons. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged as a key principle of the Cold War. The idea that if one superpower launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with such force that both sides would be destroyed. The arms race escalated throughout the Cold War, with both sides testing increasingly powerful nuclear bombs. In 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, though both sides continued to build up their arsenals. By the late 1970s, the U.S. and Soviet Union each possessed thousands of nuclear warheads, creating a balance of terror that kept both nations from launching a direct attack on each other. Vietnam War, another proxy conflict. Another significant proxy conflict of the Cold War was the Vietnam War, which took place between 1955 and 1975. Vietnam had been a French colony, but after World War II, it was divided into North and South Vietnam. The North was communist, led by Ho Chi Minh, while the South was backed by the United States and other anti-communist allies. The U.S. feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, it would trigger the domino effect, causing other countries in Southeast Asia to follow suit. Thus, the United States became heavily involved in supporting the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North. The Vietnam War became one of the most controversial conflicts in U.S. history. The war was marked by intense guerrilla warfare, the use of chemical weapons, and heavy casualties. The U.S. military's inability to defeat the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong, despite superior technology and firepower, led to growing opposition to the war at home. Public protests, especially after events like the My Lai massacre, in which U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians, made the war deeply unpopular. By 1973, the United States withdrew from Vietnam under the Paris Peace Accords, leaving the South Vietnamese government to face the North alone. In 1975, the North captured Saigon, marking the fall of South Vietnam and the unification of the country under communist rule. The Vietnam War was a clear example of the Cold War's proxy conflicts, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in regional wars without direct confrontation. The space race, the battle for supremacy in space. The Cold War was also fought in the skies. The space race was a symbolic battle between the United States and the Soviet Union to demonstrate their technological and scientific superiority. The Soviet Union struck first with the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. This achievement sent shockwaves through the U.S. and spurred a sense of urgency to catch up. In response, the U.S. government established NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and invested heavily in space exploration. The culmination of this effort came in 1969, when the U.S. Apollo 11 mission successfully landed astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the Moon. Armstrong's famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," marked a historic victory in the space race and solidified America's position as the leader in space exploration. But the space race was not just about reaching the moon. It was a symbolic competition that showcased the technological and ideological superiority of each nation. It was a critical front in the Cold War, and though both superpowers eventually reached remarkable milestones in space, it was the United States that ultimately claimed victory in this particular aspect of the Cold War. By the 1980s, the Cold War was nearing its end. The ideological, political, and military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had stretched over 4 decades, leaving an indelible mark on the global landscape. The two superpowers had engaged in countless proxy wars, the arms race, and a struggle for dominance in every part of the globe. Yet the end of the Cold War did not come with a climactic battle or a major military confrontation. Instead, it unfolded through a series of political shifts, economic crises, and changes in leadership that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and a profound transformation in global geopolitics. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev and reforms in the Soviet Union. One of the key turning points in the Cold War came with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev was a reformer who sought to address the deepening economic stagnation and political repression within the Soviet Union. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, marked a significant shift in Soviet governance. Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of speech, political discussion, and media coverage, while perestroika aimed at restructuring the Soviet economy by introducing some market-like reforms and reducing central control. Gorbachev's decision to ease tensions with the West was also pivotal. In 1987, he signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) treaty with U.S. President Ronald Reagan, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles, marking the first time in the Cold War that both superpowers agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals. Gorbachev also withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan, effectively ending the Soviet Union's costly and unsuccessful 10-year occupation. These actions signaled a shift away from the aggressive policies of previous Soviet leaders, and the world began to take notice. The fall of the Berlin Wall, a symbol of reunification. One of the most iconic events marking the end of the Cold War was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. For nearly 3 decades, the wall had been the physical symbol of the division between East and West, and between the Communist East and Capitalist West. The Berlin Wall had separated families, restricted movement, and became a powerful reminder of the ideological and physical barriers that defined the Cold War. However, by the late 1980s, there was growing pressure from East Germans and other Eastern Bloc citizens for greater political freedoms and reform. In 1989, mass protests erupted in East Germany, calling for greater openness and reforms. The government, struggling to maintain control, made a fateful announcement regarding travel restrictions, which led to the chaotic and dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall. Crowds of East and West Germans converged at the wall, celebrating their newfound freedom by tearing it down, literally and symbolically reunifying the city. This event was seen not just as a victory for Germany, but as a triumph for freedom and democracy. The fall of the Berlin Wall sparked a chain reaction across Eastern Europe, where communist governments began to collapse one by one. In countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria, popular movements demanded democratic reforms, and Soviet-backed regimes fell without significant resistance. The wave of change swept through Eastern Europe, signaling the end of Soviet domination in the region and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The events in Eastern Europe, coupled with Gorbachev's reforms, set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. In 1991, a failed coup by hardline Communist Party members against Gorbachev weakened his authority and accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet system. Republics within the Soviet Union, including the Baltics, Ukraine, and Georgia, declared independence, and the central government was unable to hold the empire together. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and Gorbachev resigned as president. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the definitive end of the Cold War, as the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism was decisively won by the West. The United States, as the sole remaining superpower, emerged from the Cold War as the dominant global force. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of independent republics, including Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Russia, under President Boris Yeltsin, was left to navigate the difficult transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based one. The economic upheaval, privatization of state assets, and rise of oligarchs created significant challenges for the newly formed Russian Federation. The global impact and the New World Order. The end of the Cold War fundamentally changed the global political order. The world was no longer divided into two hostile ideological camps, and the United States became the uncontested leader of the Western world. The collapse of the Soviet Union also led to the expansion of liberal democracy and market capitalism across former Soviet territories and Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic transitioned to democracies and joined organizations like the European Union and NATO, solidifying their integration into the West. However, the end of the Cold War also created new challenges. While the Soviet Union was no longer a superpower, regional conflicts and civil wars erupted in various parts of the world, often fueled by ethnic, religious, or political tensions. The collapse of the Soviet Union also created a power vacuum in Central Asia and the Caucasus, where new geopolitical struggles emerged. In the Middle East, the post-Cold War period saw the rise of Islamist movements and the continued instability brought on by unresolved regional conflicts. The United States, now the only superpower, faced its own challenges in the New World Order. The 1990s were marked by both optimism for the spread of democracy and globalization, but also by deepening divisions and new security threats. The 9/11 attacks in 2001 would demonstrate that, even after the Cold War's end, the world remained deeply connected and vulnerable to new kinds of global challenges, particularly in the realms of terrorism and non-state actors. The legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War's legacy continues to shape the world in many ways. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism, which once defined global politics, has given way to more complex issues in the 21st century, such as global economic inequality, the rise of China, and new geopolitical tensions. However, the institutions and frameworks created during the Cold War, such as the United Nations, NATO, and the World Bank, continue to play key roles in addressing global issues. The end of the Cold War also marked the triumph of liberal democracy and market economies, but these systems too have faced criticism in the decades since. The rise of populism, authoritarianism, and nationalism, especially in the wake of the financial crises of the 21st century, has shown that the victory of the West in the Cold War did not necessarily lead to universal stability or prosperity. The Cold War shaped much of the modern world, from the division of Germany to the way nations approach security, diplomacy, and trade. The memories of the arms race, the threat of nuclear war, and the struggles of ideological proxy wars are still vivid in the collective consciousness. The Cold War may have ended, but its reverberations continue to influence the political landscape today. The Age of Exploration, which began in the late 15th century and spanned through the 17th century, marked a transformative period in global history. During this time, European nations set out on ambitious journeys to discover new lands, expand their influence, and establish trade routes. What started as a search for spices and wealth evolved into the exploration and colonization of the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, reshaping the global map and setting the stage for the modern world. The motivations behind the Age of Exploration were varied. For many European powers, the drive was economic, particularly the desire to find new trade routes to the east. For centuries, European merchants had relied on overland routes to trade with India, China, and the Middle East, but these routes were long, dangerous, and increasingly controlled by Ottoman and Venetian merchants. The Portuguese and Spanish, seeking a direct sea route to Asia, turned to the oceans for answers. The Portuguese were the pioneers of this new era. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century, Portugal invested heavily in maritime exploration. Prince Henry established a school of navigation in Sagres, where cartographers, shipbuilders, and navigators came together to develop new techniques and technologies for long-distance sea travel. With the introduction of the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship, the Portuguese began to explore the West African coast and chart unknown waters. One of the first great milestones in the Age of Exploration came in 1488, when Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, proving that a sea route to Asia was possible. This discovery paved the way for Vasco da Gama's famous voyage to India in 1498, where he successfully reached the city of Calicut, establishing a direct sea route to Asia for the first time. At the same time, Spain, under the sponsorship of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, was also preparing to explore new horizons. Unlike the Portuguese, who focused on the east, the Spanish were determined to find a westward route to Asia. This led to the famous voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492. Columbus, a Genoese navigator, believed that by sailing west, he could reach Asia faster than by going around Africa. Although he was mistaken in his calculations, believing the Earth was much smaller than it actually was, he convinced the Spanish monarchs to support his expedition. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After several weeks at sea, Columbus landed on an island in the Caribbean on October 12, 1492. Though he believed he had reached the East Indies, Columbus had instead stumbled upon a new world, one that would change the course of history forever. The New World, Exploration and Conquest. The discovery of the Americas by Columbus set off a wave of exploration and colonization that would reshape the global political and economic landscape. Columbus's voyages, followed by the exploration of other Spanish and Portuguese navigators, such as Ferdinand Magellan and Amerigo Vespucci, opened the floodgates for European powers to begin colonizing the lands they had discovered. In the early 16th century, Spanish conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro set out to conquer the rich and powerful empires of the Americas. Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, and within just a few years had defeated the mighty Aztec Empire. Pizarro followed suit in 1532, conquering the Inca Empire in modern-day Peru. These conquests were fueled by a combination of advanced military technology, alliances with indigenous groups, and the spread of European diseases such as smallpox, which devastated native populations. The Spanish quickly established vast colonies across Central and South America, extracting gold, silver, and other precious resources that enriched the Spanish crown. Spain's empire in the Americas grew to include modern-day Mexico, Peru, and much of the southwestern United States, while Portugal established a colonial presence in Brazil. The global impact of exploration. While Spain and Portugal led the way in the age of exploration, other European nations soon joined the race for overseas expansion. The Italian navigator John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached North America in 1497, while the French explorer Jacques Cartier navigated the St. Lawrence River in Canada in 1534. The English and the French established colonies in North America, with the English founding Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, and the French establishing Quebec in 1608. These explorations set the stage for a new global order. The world was no longer separated into isolated regions, but interconnected by trade, exploration, and colonization. The age of exploration led to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, where enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. This brutal system of forced labor fueled the economies of European colonies in the Americas and contributed to the development of the modern global economy. The rise of colonial empires also had significant cultural and religious consequences. The spread of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, was a key part of European colonization. Catholic missionaries, including Jesuits, traveled to the Americas, Asia, and Africa to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. The cultural exchange between Europe and the Americas also led to the introduction of new crops, animals, and technologies to both sides of the Atlantic, further integrating the world into a global trade network. However, the age of exploration was not without its darker side. The brutal treatment of indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the spread of European diseases that decimated native populations, and the exploitation of natural resources set the stage for centuries of colonial domination and suffering. Indigenous cultures were often destroyed or radically transformed by European contact, and the exploitation of land, labor, and human life left a legacy of inequality and injustice that would persist for centuries. The end of the Age of Exploration. By the 17th century, the age of exploration began to slow down, but it did not cease. European powers had established vast colonial empires, and the world was largely mapped and explored. However, the legacy of exploration continued to influence global history. New trade routes, political dynamics, and cultural exchanges had shaped the development of the modern world. As European powers continued to expand their colonial holdings, they faced new challenges. Tensions between colonial powers, conflicts with indigenous peoples, and the changing demands of global trade. The Age of Exploration had set in motion a period of exploration, conquest, and colonization that would not only change the fate of the continents, but also lead to the formation of modern nations, economies, and global systems of trade and politics. But as the world became more interconnected, would it be possible for European powers to maintain their dominance, or would new forces of change, such as nationalism, independence movements, and the emergence of new global powers reshaped the world once again. The age of exploration was not only about discovery, it was also about transformation. As European explorers mapped new territories and established colonies, the world underwent a radical shift. While the immediate consequences of exploration included the spread of new ideas, goods, and people, it also initiated an era of conquest, exploitation, and conflict that would shape the world for centuries to come. The legacies of exploration, particularly the rise of European colonial empires, would leave an indelible mark on global history. The expansion of European colonial empires. The first wave of exploration resulted in the establishment of vast colonial empires that spanned the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Spain and Portugal, the two earliest pioneers in exploration, established enormous colonial territories. Spain dominated much of the Americas, including the rich gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru. Portugal, with its early explorations along the African coast and into India, carved out colonies in Brazil and parts of Africa. By the 16th and 17th centuries, other European powers such as England, France, and the Netherlands began to establish their own colonies. The British set up colonies along the eastern coast of North America, most notably in Virginia and Massachusetts, while the French focused on Canada and parts of the Mississippi River Valley. The Dutch, primarily through the Dutch East India Company, became major players in trade and colonization in Southeast Asia. The establishment of these European empires was not simply about territorial conquest, it was also about control of global trade. European powers sought to dominate the flow of goods such as gold, spices, sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Colonies were established to supply raw materials for European industries, and the wealth extracted from these colonies fueled the economies of the mother countries. The transatlantic slave trade, a legacy of exploitation. One of the darkest legacies of the age of exploration was the transatlantic slave trade. The discovery of the Americas and the subsequent colonization of vast territories led to a demand for labor to work on plantations, particularly in the production of crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The indigenous populations of the Americas, decimated by disease and warfare, could not provide the labor needed to sustain the colonies. As a result, European powers turned to Africa, forcibly bringing millions of Africans across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, an estimated 12 million Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas. The slave trade became a cornerstone of the global economy, enriching European merchants and colonial powers. The economies of the Americas, particularly the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern U.S., became deeply dependent on the labor of enslaved Africans. The brutality and exploitation of the transatlantic slave trade left a lasting legacy of racial inequality, social disruption, and injustice. The legacy of slavery continues to reverberate today, particularly in the Americas, where the descendants of enslaved Africans played a pivotal role in shaping the culture, economy, and history of the New World. The trade also had long-lasting effects on Africa, with the loss of millions of people weakening many African societies and disrupting regional economies and political structures. The spread of Christianity and cultural exchange. In addition to the economic and political changes brought about by exploration, the age of exploration also facilitated the spread of Christianity. Catholic missionaries, especially those from Spain and Portugal, were among the first to travel to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, with the goal of converting indigenous populations to Christianity. The spread of Christianity became a central aspect of European colonial policy, often intertwined with the justification for conquest and colonization. In the Americas, missionary efforts led to the establishment of missions and churches in newly conquered territories. In parts of Asia and Africa, European missionaries built churches, schools, and hospitals. Christianity became a dominant religion in the colonies, often replacing indigenous belief systems and altering social and cultural practices. In some regions, such as the Philippines, Christianity became deeply integrated into local cultures, while in others, such as parts of Africa, the spread of Christianity remained more limited. At the same time, the age of exploration also led to significant cultural exchanges between Europe and the rest of the world. The exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between the Old and New Worlds, commonly referred to as the Columbian Exchange, was transformative. Crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco, which had originated in the Americas, were introduced to Europe, Africa, and Asia. These crops revolutionized agriculture in many parts of the world and helped sustain growing populations. Similarly, Old World animals such as horses, cattle, and pigs were brought to the Americas, transforming indigenous agricultural and cultural practices. Diseases, unfortunately, also traveled in both directions. The smallpox, measles, and influenza viruses brought by Europeans devastated indigenous populations in the Americas, leading to the deaths of millions of people. Meanwhile, syphilis, which originated in the Americas, spread to Europe. The beginning of the global economy. The age of exploration was also a catalyst for the development of the global economy. As European powers established colonies and trade routes, they linked distant parts of the world into a single economic system. The movement of goods, people, and capital between Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas laid the groundwork for the modern global economy. Trade routes expanded, with new commodities flowing between the continents. The Spanish and Portuguese established trading posts in Africa and Asia, while the Dutch and British built large, multinational trading empires, such as the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. These trading companies operated on an international scale, controlling vast amounts of trade in goods such as spices, silk, tea, and later, textiles and opium. The rise of these early capitalist ventures had profound effects on the development of global trade, the creation of wealth, and the rise of industrialized economies in Europe. The flow of precious metals, such as gold and silver from the Americas, helped fuel European economies and led to the development of banking systems and stock markets in places like London and Amsterdam. However, this new global economy was also built on exploitation. Colonialism, the slave trade, and the extraction of resources from colonized regions created vast inequalities that continue to affect the world today. Indigenous populations were displaced, enslaved, and often wiped out by European colonial activities, while the wealth generated by colonial economies was concentrated in the hands of European elites. The decline of the age of exploration, the rise of nationalism and independence movements. By the 18th century, the age of exploration began to give way to a new era. The rise of nationalism, growing political awareness, and the emergence of powerful states made the old colonial empires less sustainable. The Enlightenment and the ideals of liberty, equality, and self-determination sparked independence movements around the world, particularly in the Americas. The American Revolution, 1775–1783, was one of the first successful uprisings against colonial rule, inspiring others to seek independence. The French Revolution, 1780–1799, followed, further challenging the old systems of monarchy and imperial rule. Across Latin America, movements for independence, led by figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martin, toppled Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule, leading to the creation of new nations by the early 19th century. These independence movements marked the decline of the old colonial empires and the beginning of a new world order, one in which former colonies sought to break free from European domination. The legacy of exploration was thus mixed. While it led to the expansion of European influence and the creation of global networks of trade and exchange. It also sowed the seeds for resistance and decolonization movements that would reshape the political landscape in the modern era. The age of exploration had far-reaching consequences, reshaping not only the regions directly involved, but also the global political and economic systems. The voyages of discovery laid the groundwork for the modern world, with the rise of colonial empires, the expansion of global trade, and the eventual rise of new nations that sought to break free from colonial rule. The legacy of this period remains embedded in the world's social, political, and economic systems today. The rise of colonial empires and global trade. With the discovery of the New World and the establishment of colonial empires, the modern global economy began to take shape. The European powers, particularly Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established vast colonies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. These colonies provided the European nations with access to valuable resources such as gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, and later cotton. In return, European goods flooded into the colonies, and the world's oceans became the highways for global trade. The creation of vast colonial empires had two primary consequences. First, it created an immense wealth transfer from the colonies to the European metropoles. The extraction of precious metals from the Americas, the cultivation of cash crops like sugar and tobacco, and the exploitation of slave labor in the Caribbean and South America enriched European economies. The wealth generated by colonial trade fueled the growth of European cities, the rise of banking institutions, and the development of global commerce. With the establishment of trading companies such as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Second, the creation of these empires drastically altered the balance of power in the world. The era of European dominance began, and with it, European countries asserted control over vast territories, influencing the politics, cultures, and economies of regions across the globe. The colonial system created a new world order, with European powers at the center of global affairs and their colonies acting as sources of wealth and resources. The slave trade, an inextricable legacy of the Age of Exploration. One of the most brutal legacies of the Age of Exploration was the transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 16th century and continued into the 19th century. The rapid expansion of European colonies in the Americas required a large labor force, especially on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. Due to the decimation of indigenous populations through disease, forced labor, and violence, European powers turned to Africa as a source of labor. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, where they endured inhumane conditions as slaves. The slave trade was central to the global economy of the time, forming a key component of the triangular trade. European merchants brought goods to Africa, traded them for enslaved people, and then transported the slaves to the Americas. From the Americas, raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton were shipped to Europe. This trade system was enormously profitable for European countries, but it had devastating consequences for Africa, where entire societies were disrupted and millions of people were enslaved. The transatlantic slave trade left a lasting legacy of racial inequality and exploitation that would echo throughout history. The repercussions of slavery continue to affect social, economic, and political systems in both the Americas and Africa, with the legacy of racism and economic disparity still deeply ingrained in many societies today. Colonialism and the spread of European culture and religion. European exploration and colonization also led to the spread of European culture, religion, and language across the world. Christianity, particularly Catholicism, was a driving force behind European colonization. Catholic missionaries, often accompanied by soldiers and settlers, sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, establishing churches, schools, and missions across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. In many cases, native belief systems were either suppressed or replaced by Christianity, forever altering the spiritual and cultural landscapes of entire regions. In addition to religion, European cultural practices, languages, and governance systems spread to the colonies. Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French became the dominant languages in their respective colonies, and European legal and educational systems were introduced to indigenous populations. The creation of European-style governments, with centralized power structures and European-based legal systems, significantly altered the social fabric of colonized societies. While this cultural exchange also led to the blending of European and indigenous cultures in some regions, it often resulted in the destruction of native traditions, languages, and systems of governance. The forced integration of indigenous people into European-dominated societies had lasting effects on the cultural identities of many regions. The Age of Exploration and the dawn of the modern world. The Age of Exploration was instrumental in shaping the modern world. The globalization of trade, the spread of European culture and religion, the establishment of colonial empires, and the rise of capitalism all emerged from the period of exploration. Yet, the consequences of this era were not only economic and cultural, they were also political. European powers began to shape the course of global history by redrawing political boundaries, establishing imperial systems, and creating new trade networks that influenced global politics for centuries to come. By the 19th century, however, many of the colonial empires that had been established during the Age of Exploration began to show signs of strain. Colonized peoples, inspired by the ideas of liberty and self-determination that had emerged during the Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions, began to demand their independence. Nationalist movements in Latin America, India, and Africa grew in strength, eventually leading to the dismantling of colonial empires in the 20th century. Yet even as these empires crumbled, the legacy of exploration persisted. The global trade routes, the capitalist economies, and the political structures established during the Age of Exploration have left lasting marks on the world. The modern world, with its complex system of interconnected economies, multinational corporations, and political alliances, owes much of its structure to the explorations and colonization that took place during this pivotal era. The end of exploration and the rise of new frontiers. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Age of Exploration had essentially come to an end. European powers had mapped most of the world, and new frontiers in terms of territorial expansion were limited. However, exploration did not stop entirely. It shifted to new domains. The exploration of space became the next great frontier, driven by the same human desire to discover the unknown and push boundaries. The space race, which unfolded during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, was the modern continuation of the exploratory spirit that characterized the Age of Exploration. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957 and the subsequent moon landing by the United States in 1969 were monumental achievements that redefined the possibilities of human exploration. In this way, the Age of Exploration, though historically rooted in the 15th through 17th centuries, is an ongoing legacy, one that continues to shape human curiosity and ambition. From the exploration of new territories on Earth to the exploration of the cosmos, the pursuit of discovery remains central to the human experience. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century in Great Britain, fundamentally transformed the way people lived, worked, and interacted with the world. It marked the transition from an agrarian society, where most people worked in farming or small-scale artisan crafts, to an industrial society characterized by factory-based mass production. The revolution spread throughout Europe and the United States, and its effects rippled across the globe, reshaping economies, urbanization, and even culture. Before the Industrial Revolution, society was largely agrarian. Most people lived in rural areas, farming small plots of land and engaging in manual labor. This rural economy was largely self-sustaining, with people growing their own food and producing goods by hand. The methods of production were inefficient and time-consuming, and while technological advancements did exist, they were limited in scope. The roots of the Industrial Revolution can be traced back to several factors that converged in Britain in the late 1700s. Among the most significant of these was the Agricultural Revolution, which introduced new farming techniques and equipment that significantly boosted crop yields. The development of crop rotation systems, selective breeding, and new tools like the seed drill, invented by Jethro Tull, improved agricultural efficiency. As a result, fewer laborers were needed in the countryside, leading many people to migrate to cities in search of work. At the same time, Britain had access to abundant natural resources, including coal and iron, which were essential for powering the new machines and building infrastructure like railways and factories. Britain also had a well-developed banking system, a stable political environment, and a global trade network, all of which contributed to the rise of industrialization. The first factories and the rise of mass production. The Industrial Revolution truly began with the invention of new machines that could produce goods more efficiently. The first major breakthrough was the steam engine, developed and improved by James Watt in the 1770s. Watt's steam engine, more efficient than previous designs, allowed factories to operate independently of water sources, and it became the primary power source for factories, mines, and transportation systems. The introduction of mechanized spinning and weaving processes in the textile industry was another crucial development. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, which allowed workers to spin multiple threads simultaneously, dramatically increasing productivity. Later innovations, such as Richard Arkwright's water frame, 1771, and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, 1779, further revolutionized textile production. These machines made it possible to produce cloth much more quickly and cheaply, creating an industrial textile industry that dominated Britain. As factories began to emerge, the face of production shifted from the domestic system, in which people worked from home or small workshops, to factory-based mass production. The factory system brought together large groups of workers who operated machines in centralized locations, creating economies of scale. Goods were produced in large quantities, and workers became increasingly specialized, focusing on one part of the production process rather than crafting an entire product. This shift dramatically changed the nature of labor. Factory workers, unlike artisans, were often required to work long hours in difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions. However, the Industrial Revolution was driven by the promise of increased efficiency and cheaper production costs, and it became clear that mass production was the future. Urbanization and the rise of industrial cities. One of the most significant consequences of the Industrial Revolution was the rapid urbanization that took place in Britain and other industrializing nations. As factories sprouted up across cities, people from rural areas flocked to urban centers in search of jobs. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool in Britain saw their populations explode, growing from small towns into industrial metropolises in a matter of decades. Urbanization, however, brought about significant social and environmental challenges. The growth of industrial cities led to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and widespread poverty. Workers lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, often in slums with little access to clean water or adequate sewage systems. The rise of factories also meant that many workers, including women and children, worked long hours in dangerous conditions, often in poorly ventilated and hazardous environments. These social issues sparked debates about the rights of workers, and over time, calls for reform grew louder. Labor unions began to form in an effort to improve working conditions, and governments began to pass laws regulating factory work, including laws that limited child labor and established minimum wage standards. These early labor movements were critical in securing many of the rights that workers enjoy today. The spread of industrialization. While the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, it soon spread to other parts of Europe and North America. By the early 19th century, the textile industry had expanded to countries like Belgium, France, and Germany. The United States, with its growing economy, was soon to follow suit, particularly with the development of factories in the Northeast. The creation of the American factory system was fueled by the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793, which revolutionized cotton production in the southern United States, and the use of interchangeable parts in manufacturing, which was popularized by Whitney and others. The spread of industrialization had profound effects on economies and societies across the world. In addition to the economic transformations, industrialization also led to social changes, particularly in terms of class structures. The rise of a new middle class, consisting of industrialists, entrepreneurs, and professionals, marked a shift in social hierarchies. At the same time, industrialization exacerbated social inequality, with factory owners and the wealthy benefiting from industrial profits, while the working class faced harsh conditions and low wages. By the mid-19th century, industrialization had become a global phenomenon. The development of railways, steamships, and later, telegraphs, helped to connect regions and facilitated global trade. The world was becoming increasingly interconnected, and this new era of industry and innovation would set the stage for further technological advances, geopolitical conflicts, and social changes. The Industrial Revolution, which fundamentally transformed economies and societies, was not just about technological advancements or the rise of factories. It also brought profound social, economic, and political changes that would define the modern world. While industrialization brought about unprecedented economic growth and material wealth, it also led to significant social upheaval, inequality, and political struggles. As the new industrial world began to take shape, it gave birth to movements that would change the course of history, from the rise of labor rights to the spread of socialist ideas. The rise of the working class and urbanization. One of the most significant social changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution was the emergence of the working class, often referred to as the proletariat. Before industrialization, the majority of people in Europe and America lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture or small-scale crafts. However, with the rise of factories, millions of people moved to urban centers in search of jobs, creating a rapidly growing urban working class. The expansion of cities such as Manchester, London, and New York led to the rise of industrial metropolises. As factories sprang up, the demand for labor grew, and workers, many of them women and children, were employed in factories, mines, and mills. These workers lived in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, often in poorly constructed slums, where disease and poverty were rampant. Factory work was grueling, with workers facing long hours, dangerous machinery, and low wages. The working class, though benefiting from steady employment, often lived in conditions that were far from ideal. Workers endured grueling workweeks of 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week. They were subject to harsh discipline and often worked in hazardous conditions, which led to frequent accidents and deaths. Many workers also lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions in rapidly growing cities, with no access to clean water, waste disposal, or adequate housing. The dramatic growth of the working class led to new social tensions, as industrialists became wealthier while workers remained poor. This inequality fueled resentment, leading to the rise of movements advocating for workers' rights and improved living conditions. The birth of labor movements and the struggle for workers' rights. As the working class became more organized, labor movements began to form in response to the brutal conditions in factories and the widespread exploitation of workers. Workers began to push for better wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. The rise of industrial capitalism, with its focus on profit maximization and efficiency, was often at odds with the well-being of workers, who were treated as expendable parts in the machinery of production. Labor unions began to form in the early 19th century, although they were initially met with resistance from employers and governments. Strikes and protests became common as workers fought for better working conditions. The Chartist movement in Britain, which began in the 1830s, was one of the earliest examples of a working-class movement pushing for political reforms, including universal suffrage and the right to vote. In many cases, labor protests were met with violent repression, with governments and factory owners using the police and military to break strikes. However, over time, the labor movement gained traction. In Britain, the passage of the Factory Acts in the early 19th century began to limit the hours children and women could work. And in the U.S., the labor movement led to the eventual creation of labor laws that regulated working conditions and wages. As industrial capitalism continued to expand, the need for more organized labor movements became clear. The working-class struggle for better conditions would continue throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and it laid the foundation for modern labor rights and social reforms. Economic growth and the rise of capitalism. While industrialization resulted in hardship for many workers, it also led to tremendous economic growth. The rise of factories and mass production significantly increased output and efficiency, leading to an era of prosperity for industrial nations. Britain, the birthplace of industrialization, experienced rapid growth in industries like textiles, coal mining, iron production, and shipbuilding. As industries expanded, new markets opened up for goods, both domestically and internationally. The creation of a global economy, fueled by the expansion of colonial empires and the rise of international trade, meant that goods produced in European factories could be sold in markets all over the world. This interconnected global economy was underpinned by the rise of capitalist enterprises and the growth of financial institutions. Banking, finance, and insurance industries flourished, and the stock market became a central feature of capitalist economies. Investors provided the capital necessary for industrial ventures, and the accumulation of wealth among factory owners, merchants, and financiers led to the rise of a new economic elite, the bourgeoisie. This new class of industrial capitalists played a significant role in shaping the political and economic landscape of the 19th and 20th centuries. However, this rapid economic growth was not without its contradictions. While factory owners amassed great wealth, the working class continued to live in poverty. The growing wealth inequality between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat became one of the central issues of the industrial age, fueling political and social unrest. These tensions contributed to the rise of socialist and communist movements, which advocated for the redistribution of wealth and the improvement of workers' conditions. The rise of socialism and the critique of capitalism. The social inequality and harsh conditions faced by workers during the Industrial Revolution led to the rise of socialist and communist ideologies, which sought to challenge the capitalist system. Early socialists, such as Robert Owen and Charles Fourier, proposed models of cooperative communities where workers could share in the benefits of production. These early ideas laid the groundwork for more radical movements in the 19th century. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels became the most prominent critics of industrial capitalism, with the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Marx argued that capitalism was inherently exploitative, and that the working class, the proletariat, was being exploited by the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. Marx envisioned a revolution in which the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie, abolish private property, and establish a classless society. Marx's ideas became the foundation of Marxism, which later influenced the formation of socialist and communist political movements around the world. In the decades following the publication of the Communist Manifesto, revolutionary movements inspired by Marxist thought would gain ground, particularly in Europe and Russia. The Russian Revolution of 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, ultimately led to the creation of the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist state. The rise of the middle class and the changing role of women. Alongside the growth of the working class, the Industrial Revolution also gave rise to a new middle class. This class, which included industrialists, bankers, professionals, and entrepreneurs, was the driving force behind the expanding capitalist economy. The middle class became an influential political and social force, advocating for policies that promoted free market capitalism, individual rights, and limited government intervention in the economy. As industrialization progressed, the roles of women also began to change. While women worked in factories, particularly in textiles and garment production, their labor was often underpaid and undervalued. At the same time, the rise of the middle class led to a shift in social expectations for women. In middle-class families, women were often expected to take on the role of the homemaker, overseeing domestic duties and raising children. This created a distinct separation between the working-class women, who labored in factories, and the middle-class women who managed households. The early feminist movements, which began in the 19th century, challenged these social roles. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft and Florence Nightingale began advocating for women's rights, education, and opportunities outside the domestic sphere. The women's suffrage movement, which gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sought the right to vote and more equal rights in society. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, was not merely a period of technological innovation and economic growth. It was a defining moment in human history that reshaped society in profound and lasting ways. The economic, political, and social changes that emerged from the Industrial Revolution laid the groundwork for the modern world, influencing everything from urbanization and labor movements to the rise of new ideologies and the development of global trade networks. Its legacy continues to resonate today in the structure of modern economies, the pace of technological advancement, and the ongoing challenges of inequality and environmental sustainability. The urbanization of the modern world. One of the most visible legacies of the Industrial Revolution was the transformation of cities. Prior to industrialization, most people lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture or small-scale crafts. However, as factories began to emerge, people flocked to urban centers in search of employment, leading to an explosion in urban populations. Cities such as Manchester, London, and New York grew rapidly, becoming the epicenters of industrial activity. This shift from rural to urban living, known as urbanization, led to the creation of modern cities and the rise of an entirely new way of life. The concentration of people in urban areas fostered innovation, cultural exchange, and the expansion of services and industries. Cities became hubs of commerce, education, and social activity. Yet, urbanization also brought with it significant challenges. The rapid growth of cities outpaced the development of infrastructure, leading to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate housing. Disease spread quickly in densely packed neighborhoods, and pollution from factories became a common feature of industrial cities. Despite these challenges, urbanization also played a crucial role in shaping the modern world. It laid the foundation for the development of modern urban planning and the creation of public services such as sanitation, public transportation, and health care. The growth of cities also created new social dynamics, with the emergence of distinct working class, middle class, and elite neighborhoods. These divisions would become a source of social tension and would eventually lead to the rise of social movements advocating for workers' rights, political reform, and the improvement of living conditions. The rise of global trade and capitalism. The Industrial Revolution gave birth to the modern capitalist economy, which was characterized by mass production, global trade, and the rise of multinational corporations. The efficiency and scale of industrial production allowed goods to be produced more cheaply and quickly, which in turn fueled the expansion of markets and trade networks. By the mid-19th century, industrialized nations like Britain, France, and the United States had established vast empires that spanned the globe, controlling raw materials, resources, and trade routes. The rise of global trade and capitalism during the Industrial Revolution also led to the development of financial institutions, such as banks, stock markets, and insurance companies, which provided the capital necessary to fund industrial ventures. The growth of industries like textiles, iron, coal, and steel created enormous wealth for factory owners and investors. However, this wealth was often concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of workers faced poor wages and difficult working conditions. The global nature of industrial capitalism also had profound geopolitical consequences. The competition for resources and markets led to imperialism, as European powers expanded their empires in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The scramble for colonies, particularly in Africa, was driven by the need for raw materials and new markets for industrial goods. This period of imperialism would have lasting effects on the global political landscape, as colonized nations struggled for independence and sovereignty throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The rise of socialism, communism, and workers' rights. The economic and social inequalities that accompanied the Industrial Revolution led to the rise of new political ideologies and movements. The concentration of wealth in the hands of industrialists and the exploitation of workers in factories fueled discontent among the working class, which sought better wages, working conditions, and political representation. This dissatisfaction led to the growth of socialist and communist movements, which sought to challenge the capitalist system and redistribute wealth. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century, were vocal critics of industrial capitalism. In their Communist Manifesto, 1848, Marx and Engels argued that capitalism inherently exploited workers, and that the only way to achieve true equality and justice was through a revolution in which the working class would overthrow the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and seize control of the means of production. Their ideas laid the foundation for the development of socialist and communist political movements, which would play a key role in the 20th century, particularly in Russia, China, and other parts of the world. The Industrial Revolution also gave rise to the labor movement, which sought to improve the lives of workers through collective bargaining, strikes, and the formation of labor unions. The labor movement succeeded in securing key worker protections, such as limits on working hours, safer working conditions, and the establishment of minimum wage laws. The struggles of the labor movement during the Industrial Revolution laid the groundwork for the development of modern labor rights, which continue to be a central issue in contemporary politics. Technological advancements and the digital revolution. The Industrial Revolution set the stage for the ongoing march of technological progress. The innovations of the 18th and 19th centuries, such as the steam engine, the spinning jenny, and the mechanization of agriculture, were only the beginning. As industrialization spread across the globe, new technologies continued to emerge, each revolutionizing the way people lived and worked. The development of electricity, the telephone, the internal combustion engine, and the airplane all marked significant milestones in the evolution of modern technology. Perhaps the most profound transformation in the modern world came with the digital revolution in the late 20th century. Building on the technological foundations laid by the Industrial Revolution, the rise of computers, the internet, and information technology created a new era of connectivity and innovation. The digital age has fundamentally altered every aspect of human life, from communication and education to work and entertainment. While the Industrial Revolution created the physical infrastructure of the modern world, the digital revolution has created a new, interconnected global society. Environmental consequences and sustainability challenges. While the Industrial Revolution brought immense benefits, it also set the stage for some of the most pressing challenges facing the world today. The rapid expansion of industry and urbanization, along with the burning of coal and other fossil fuels, led to significant environmental degradation. Air and water pollution, deforestation, and the destruction of natural habitats became widespread as industrial societies prioritized economic growth over environmental concerns. The environmental consequences of industrialization are still felt today, as climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution remain global challenges. The Industrial Revolution contributed to the emission of greenhouse gases, and the continued reliance on fossil fuels for energy has accelerated global warming. The rise of industrial agriculture and the expansion of cities have put tremendous pressure on natural resources, leading to concerns about sustainability and the future of the planet. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution, therefore, is a double-edged sword. While it brought immense technological progress and economic growth, it also created deep inequalities and environmental problems. The challenge facing the modern world is to find a way to balance economic growth and technological innovation with environmental stewardship and social justice. This is the continuing challenge of the post-industrial age: how to maintain the benefits of industrialization while mitigating its negative consequences. Conclusion: the legacy of the Industrial Revolution in the modern world. The Industrial Revolution was one of the most transformative periods in human history. It reshaped the global economy, social structures, and technological landscape, laying the foundations for the modern world. The rise of factories, the growth of cities, and the development of new technologies changed the way people lived, worked, and interacted with the world. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution is still evident today in the global economy, in the structure of modern cities, in the labor rights movements, and in the ongoing technological revolution. Yet, the challenges it introduced, social inequality, environmental degradation, and the quest for a more sustainable future, continue to shape the world in profound ways. The Industrial Revolution is both a testament to human ingenuity and a reminder of the costs of progress. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was one of the most transformative events in history. It not only reshaped France but also had a profound impact on the world, influencing revolutions and movements for social change across Europe and the Americas. At its heart, the French Revolution was driven by a combination of economic crisis, social inequality, and the rise of revolutionary ideas that challenged centuries of tradition and monarchy. By the late 18th century, France was on the brink of collapse. The country was deeply in debt, struggling with an outdated and inefficient feudal system, and suffering from widespread poverty and famine. The monarchy, under King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, was deeply unpopular, not only because of its lavish spending at a time of national crisis, but also due to its inability to address the needs of the common people. Economic hardship was a central factor in sparking the revolution. France had been involved in costly wars, most notably the American Revolutionary War, 1775–1783, which drained the royal treasury. At the same time, poor harvests in the late 1780s led to skyrocketing bread prices and widespread hunger among the common people. The peasants, already burdened by heavy taxes and feudal obligations, found themselves struggling to survive, while the nobility continued to live in luxury. This stark contrast between the privileged few and the suffering many was a key factor in stoking revolutionary fervor. At the same time, Enlightenment ideas were spreading across Europe, challenging traditional ideas of monarchy, hierarchy, and the divine right of kings. Philosophers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau had criticized absolute monarchy and promoted the ideals of democracy, liberty, and equality. These ideas resonated with the educated bourgeoisie, middle class in France, who were increasingly frustrated by their lack of political power despite their growing economic influence. In 1789, France's financial crisis forced King Louis XVI to convene the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the three estates of French society: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, the Third Estate. The Third Estate, representing the vast majority of the population, was underrepresented and had little political power, but they were the ones most affected by the tax burden and economic crisis. When the Estates General convened in May 1789, the Third Estate found themselves increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress and the resistance from the first, clergy, and second, nobility, estates to meaningful reform. The Third Estate, backed by the bourgeoisie and intellectuals, soon declared themselves the National Assembly and took matters into their own hands. They vowed to create a new constitution that would limit the power of the monarchy and grant more political power to the common people. This marked the beginning of the French Revolution. The tension between the monarchy and the National Assembly reached a boiling point in June 1789, when the National Assembly was locked out of the meeting hall at Versailles. In defiance, they took an oath in a nearby tennis court, vowing not to disband until they had created a new constitution. This tennis court oath marked a pivotal moment in the revolution, symbolizing the people's determination to bring about change. By July 14, 1789, the mood in Paris had become tense. News of the National Assembly's actions spread, and the common people took to the streets, demanding change. The storming of the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized royal tyranny, became the flashpoint of the revolution. On that fateful day, Parisian citizens, fearing that the king might use force to crush the revolution, stormed the Bastille and freed prisoners. This act of defiance became the symbol of the people's power, and July 14th is now celebrated as Bastille Day, France's national holiday. The storming of the Bastille marked the start of a more radical phase of the revolution. As the revolution spread across the country, the old order was challenged on all fronts. The monarchy was now openly challenged, and the question became, what kind of France would emerge from the ashes of the old regime? Would the revolution lead to a fairer, more just society, or would it result in chaos and bloodshed? The French Revolution, which began with the promise of reform and liberty, soon descended into radicalism and chaos. After the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, the momentum for change was unstoppable. The National Assembly, composed of members of the Third Estate, began to dismantle the old feudal system and create a new French republic based on the principles of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. However, as the revolution progressed, it became clear that the path to a new society would not be smooth or peaceful. The abolition of the monarchy and the rise of revolutionary ideals. The first major action of the National Assembly was to declare the rights of man, ensuring the equality of all citizens before the law and asserting that the power of the state should rest with the people, not the monarchy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, passed in August 1789, became the foundational document of the revolution. It called for the end of feudal privileges, freedom of speech, and religious tolerance. As the revolution gained momentum, the French monarchy, led by King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, found its power increasingly eroded. The royal family was forced to leave the palace at Versailles and return to Paris, where they were placed under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace. This symbolized the decline of absolute monarchy in France. Despite these early reforms, the revolution quickly turned radical. In 1791, Louis XVI attempted to escape France with his family, hoping to rally royalist support. However, they were caught at Varennes and brought back to Paris, where public sentiment turned sharply against the king. The king's failed flight proved to many that he could not be trusted to lead the country, and the idea of a constitutional monarchy was quickly abandoned. In 1792, the revolutionaries abolished the monarchy altogether and declared France a republic. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were put on trial and found guilty of treason. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, followed by the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette in October. The execution of the royal family was a watershed moment, signaling that the old order had been destroyed and that a new, revolutionary France had been born. The Reign of Terror. Radical revolutionaries take control. After the fall of the monarchy, the revolution entered its most radical phase, known as the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, took control of the government in 1793. The radical Jacobin faction, which advocated for the complete destruction of the old regime and the creation of a more egalitarian society, gained power. Robespierre and his allies believed that violence was necessary to preserve the revolution and eliminate counter-revolutionary elements. The Reign of Terror, which lasted from September 1793 to July 1794, saw widespread executions of perceived enemies of the revolution. The guillotine became the symbol of the period, with thousands of people, including aristocrats, clergy, and political opponents, being executed in public. The most famous victims included the revolutionary leaders Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, who were accused of being too lenient on the enemies of the revolution. Robespierre and the radical Jacobins believed that in order to preserve the revolution, they had to purge France of anyone who threatened its ideals. This resulted in a wave of paranoia, as citizens and political factions turned on each other. People were denounced, imprisoned, and executed for crimes as trivial as having connections to the aristocracy or being too moderate in their political views. While Robespierre and the Jacobins initially enjoyed support for their uncompromising stance, the Reign of Terror became increasingly unpopular. The mass executions and the growing authoritarianism of the government led to a backlash. In 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed by guillotine, marking the end of the Reign of Terror. The revolution, having eaten its own leaders, entered a more moderate phase known as the Thermidorian reaction. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The end of the revolution. With the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, France entered a period of relative instability known as the Thermidorian reaction. The revolutionary government, which had been dominated by the Jacobins, gave way to more moderate forces. However, the revolution was far from over, and France still faced numerous challenges. The country was at war with a coalition of European powers, the economy was in turmoil, and political divisions continued to weaken the government. Amidst this instability, one figure began to rise above the rest: Napoleon Bonaparte. A brilliant military leader, Napoleon had gained fame for his victories against European coalitions and his defense of the revolution. In 1799, Napoleon staged a coup d'état and seized control of the French government, establishing himself as first consul. In 1804, he declared himself Emperor of the French, marking the end of the revolution's republican ideals and the beginning of a new, autocratic regime. Napoleon's rise to power marked a significant shift in the course of French history. Though he had originally been a product of the revolution, his reign as emperor represented a consolidation of power that contradicted the ideals of liberty and equality. Nevertheless, Napoleon implemented several reforms that had their roots in the revolution, such as the Napoleonic Code, which became the basis for legal systems in many European countries and beyond. Under Napoleon, France experienced a period of military expansion, with Napoleon leading the French Empire to dominate much of Europe. However, his wars of conquest eventually led to his downfall. In 1815, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. The legacy of the French Revolution. The French Revolution fundamentally changed the course of world history. It abolished the centuries-old system of monarchy and feudalism in France, replacing it with a republic based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Although the revolution's goals were not fully realized, its ideals inspired subsequent revolutions across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. The revolution also brought about significant social changes. The abolition of feudal privileges and the promotion of civil rights laid the groundwork for modern democratic societies. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen became a foundational document for human rights, influencing political thinkers and activists for generations. The French Revolution also sparked debates about the role of violence in political change. The Reign of Terror demonstrated the dangers of radicalism and unchecked power, while Napoleon's rise to power highlighted the potential for authoritarianism to emerge from revolutionary movements. The revolution's legacy is thus complex, marked by both triumphs and tragedies. In the end, the French Revolution was not just a historical event, but a catalyst for the development of modern political thought and the spread of democratic ideals. It transformed France and the world, leaving a legacy of liberty, equality, and the enduring struggle for justice and human rights. The French Revolution, despite its internal conflicts, excesses, and eventual shift toward authoritarianism under Napoleon, had a profound and lasting impact on both France and the world. It reshaped political systems, inspired revolutionary movements, and set the stage for a new age of political thought. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity echoed through history, influencing subsequent revolutions, the development of democratic principles, and the fight for human rights across the globe. The end of monarchy in Europe and the rise of republicanism. The French Revolution marked the end of absolute monarchy in France and inspired similar movements across Europe. The fall of Louis XVI and the rise of the French Republic challenged the long-standing power structures of Europe's monarchies. For centuries, monarchs had ruled by divine right, and the idea that people had a right to overthrow an unjust government was revolutionary. In the wake of the French Revolution, the monarchy in France was abolished, and the idea of republicanism spread across Europe. Other monarchies, including those in Italy, Spain, and Germany, faced growing opposition from revolutionary movements and the demands for constitutional change. While the full success of republicanism would take time, the French Revolution ignited a wave of political and social movements that sought to overthrow or reform traditional monarchies. The French Revolution's ideals, as expressed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, became a model for later democratic movements. These principles, liberty, equality, and fraternity, became the rallying cry for revolutions in the 19th and 20th centuries. The revolution laid the intellectual and moral foundation for political thought that would fuel future movements for social justice, civil rights, and democracy worldwide. Napoleon Bonaparte, from revolutionary leader to emperor. Though the revolution sought to create a democratic republic, the chaos of post-revolutionary France, coupled with military threats from external powers, created an opportunity for a military leader to seize power. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had risen to prominence as a military hero during the revolution, capitalized on the instability and the need for strong leadership. Napoleon's rise marked a paradoxical twist in the revolution's legacy. While he initially promised to uphold the ideals of the revolution, he ultimately crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804, consolidating power and establishing an authoritarian regime. Napoleon, however, did implement several reforms that reflected the revolution's ideals, such as the Napoleonic Code, which standardized laws across France and served as a model for legal systems in many other countries. Napoleon's military conquests spread revolutionary ideals across Europe, even as he established a new form of autocracy. His empire reached its height in the early 19th century, and the changes he introduced to European legal and political systems were felt long after his downfall. His defeat in 1815 at Waterloo and his subsequent exile to St. Helena marked the end of his empire, but his influence remained evident. The Napoleonic Wars and his legal reforms brought about a restructuring of European political systems, eventually leading to the rise of more democratic and constitutional governments. The Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave uprising. The ideals of the French Revolution also found expression in the Haitian Revolution, one of the most significant and far-reaching consequences of the revolution. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, enslaved Africans, inspired by the principles of liberty and equality, rose up against their French masters in 1791. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian slaves successfully overthrew the French colonial government, achieving the first successful slave rebellion in history. The Haitian Revolution not only resulted in the establishment of the first independent Black republic, but also dealt a significant blow to the institution of slavery. It was a powerful symbol of resistance against colonialism and racial oppression. However, the revolution was also fiercely contested, with France attempting to reassert control over its colony, leading to decades of political and military conflict. The Haitian Revolution demonstrated the universality of revolutionary ideals, showing that the principles of the French Revolution could inspire oppressed peoples to fight for their own freedom, regardless of their race or social status. The revolution's success sent shockwaves through the Atlantic world, challenging both European colonial powers and the entrenched system of slavery in the Americas. The spread of revolutionary ideas across the globe. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, spread beyond France and inspired revolutionary movements across the globe. In Europe, the Revolution and Napoleon's wars spurred waves of uprisings and demands for constitutional governments. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 sought to restore monarchies and suppress revolutionary movements, but the ideals of the revolution could not be erased. Movements for independence and democracy began to gain ground in places like Italy, Germany, and Greece. In Latin America, the French Revolution served as a model for independence movements against Spanish colonial rule. Leaders like Simón Bolívar, José de San Martin, and Miguel Hidalgo were inspired by the French Revolution's fight for liberty and equality. Over the course of the 19th century, many Latin American nations achieved independence from Spain and Portugal, establishing republics and constitutions inspired by revolutionary ideals. Even in the United States, the French Revolution had an impact. While Americans had already fought for their own independence from Britain, the French Revolution reignited debates about the nature of democracy and the role of government. The American Revolution and the French Revolution were closely linked, both part of a broader wave of political and social change that swept across the Atlantic world. The impact on social movements and the fight for rights. The French Revolution also left a lasting impact on social movements and the fight for civil rights. The revolution's call for equality and the abolition of the feudal system inspired movements for women's rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, and the rights of workers. The idea that all men were born equal before the law, regardless of their class or background, laid the foundation for later struggles for gender equality and racial equality. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the feminist movements in Europe and the United States drew on the ideals of the French Revolution, demanding suffrage, education, and equal rights for women. The abolition of slavery in the United States and other parts of the Americas was directly inspired by the revolutionary ideals of liberty and human dignity. The French Revolution's complex legacy. The legacy of the French Revolution is complex. It achieved remarkable successes, including the establishment of republican ideals, the expansion of civil rights, and the abolition of the monarchy and feudal privileges. However, it also led to violence, instability, and the rise of authoritarian rule under Napoleon. The Revolution was a profound moment of political transformation, but it also demonstrated the challenges and contradictions of revolutionary change. Ultimately, the French Revolution marked the end of an era dominated by monarchies and empires, and it set the stage for the rise of modern democratic nations. Its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity continue to inspire struggles for justice and human rights around the world. The revolution's impact was not limited to France, but reverberated across the globe, shaping the course of history for generations to come. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was one of the most defining moments in U.S. history. It was a conflict that pitted the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states, which had seceded to form the Confederate States of America. While the war was fought for several reasons, at its core, it was about the future of slavery, the balance of power between the federal government and individual states, and the nation's moral and political identity. Slavery and its role in the American economy. By the mid-19th century, the United States had become a nation deeply divided by its economic, political, and social systems. The northern states had largely industrialized, with a growing economy based on manufacturing, commerce, and immigration. The southern states, however, remained primarily agrarian, with their economy heavily reliant on slavery. In the South, the vast cotton plantations, which produced the majority of the world's cotton, depended on the labor of enslaved African Americans. Slavery had been entrenched in the southern states since the colonial period, but by the 1800s, it had become a deeply divisive issue. While the North increasingly embraced abolitionism and the idea of freeing enslaved people, the South defended slavery as vital to its economy and way of life. The moral and economic differences between the two regions fueled rising tensions throughout the first half of the 19th century. The rise of abolitionism and political polarization. In the North, the abolitionist movement was gaining momentum. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison fought tirelessly for the emancipation of enslaved people. Abolitionism was becoming a central issue in national politics, with many in the North calling for the end of slavery in the United States. Meanwhile, in the South, slavery was deeply intertwined with the economy, and many Southern leaders viewed abolition as a direct threat to their way of life. As tensions between the North and South grew, debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories acquired by the United States, such as the territories gained after the Mexican-American War, further polarized the nation. Should slavery be allowed to expand into new territories, or should it be restricted? The question was a source of intense political conflict, with both sides feeling that the outcome would determine the future of the nation. The election of Abraham Lincoln and secession. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, was elected president. His victory marked the final straw for many Southern states, who feared that Lincoln would move to abolish slavery and upset the political balance between free and slave states. While Lincoln did not initially call for the immediate abolition of slavery, he made it clear that he would oppose its expansion into new territories. This stance was enough to spark the secession of Southern states. In December 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, followed by 6 other Southern states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February 1861, these states formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. The Confederate States argued that they had the right to leave the Union and form their own government, claiming that the federal government had become too powerful and was infringing upon their rights, particularly the right to maintain slavery. The secession of the Southern states was met with shock and outrage in the North. Lincoln, while emphasizing that he did not want to interfere with slavery where it already existed, made it clear that he would not allow the Union to be dissolved. Tensions were at a boiling point, and the stage was set for war. Fort Sumter and the outbreak of war. The conflict began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a federal military post located in Charleston, South Carolina. The Union garrison, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, was forced to surrender after a bombardment by Confederate artillery. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the beginning of the Civil War, with Lincoln calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and restore the Union. In response, 4 more Southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy. The Civil War had begun, with both sides preparing for a conflict that would last for 4 long years. The war would pit brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, and friend against friend. The stakes were immense, not just for the future of slavery, but for the survival of the United States as a unified nation. The American Civil War, which began in April 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter, would last for 4 years, involving brutal battles, pivotal moments, and transformative leadership. It would shape not only the fate of the Union and the Confederacy, but also the future of slavery, racial inequality, and the very structure of the United States. The war, fought across a vast territory, saw the rise of military leaders, the implementation of new strategies, and intense fighting on both fronts. The early battles and strategic challenges. In the first months of the war, the Confederate forces gained several early victories, demonstrating the initial weakness of the Union's leadership and its military strategy. The Confederacy, led by General Robert E. Lee, was fighting on its own soil, giving it a defensive advantage. The Union, on the other hand, had to fight to preserve its unity and assert control over a vast, geographically divided nation. One of the early and most important battles of the war was the First Battle of Bull Run, July 1861, also known as First Manassas in the South. Union forces, under General Irvin McDowell, marched toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, expecting a quick victory. However, the Confederates, under General Pierre G.T. Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston, mounted a fierce defense. The battle ended in a stunning defeat for the Union, and the Confederacy's victory boosted Southern morale. This battle showed both sides that the war would not be as short or as easy as they had anticipated. In the early part of the war, both the Union and the Confederacy struggled with command and strategy. The Union leadership, particularly President Abraham Lincoln, faced challenges in finding effective generals who could lead the Union Army to victory. In contrast, the Confederate leadership, especially General Lee, proved to be highly effective in battlefield tactics, often turning the tide of battles in the Confederacy's favor despite being outnumbered. The Emancipation Proclamation and the changing nature of the war. As the war continued, the issue of slavery became increasingly central to the conflict. Early on, Lincoln had emphasized the preservation of the Union rather than the abolition of slavery, fearing that focusing on slavery might alienate the border states, slave-holding states that remained loyal to the Union and some Northern Democrats. However, as the war dragged on and Union casualties mounted, Lincoln came to see the abolition of slavery as a necessary step to weaken the Confederacy and ensure a lasting peace. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be freed on January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation was a transformative moment in the war, making the abolition of slavery a key war aim for the Union. It also allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, providing a crucial boost in manpower. The proclamation was a bold move, signaling the Union's commitment not just to preserving the nation, but also to ending the institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, but it changed the nature of the war. It made clear that the Union was fighting for a fundamentally different vision of the nation, one where slavery would not be tolerated. In the Confederacy, the proclamation galvanized the South, which saw the North's new goals as an existential threat to their way of life. Key figures, leadership on both sides. The American Civil War produced some of the most iconic military leaders in U.S. history. On the Union side, General Ulysses S. Grant would eventually emerge as the commanding general who would lead the Union to victory. Grant's relentless pursuit of victory and his ability to manage large-scale military campaigns set him apart. His leadership at the Battle of Shiloh, 1862, and his eventual victories at Vicksburg, 1863, and Appomattox Court House, 1865, would earn him national fame. Grant's opposite on the Confederate side was General Robert E. Lee, arguably the most brilliant and respected military commander of the war. Lee's tactical genius was evident in key victories such as the Second Battle of Bull Run, 1862, the Battle of Fredericksburg, 1862, and the Battle of Chancellorsville, 1863. However, Lee was fighting a losing battle. He was outnumbered, out-resourced, and unable to sustain his momentum as the Union adapted its strategy. Lee's decision to invade the North in 1863 culminated in the Battle of Gettysburg, a turning point in the war. The Battle of Gettysburg, a turning point in the war. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 13, 1863, was one of the largest and deadliest battles of the Civil War. General Lee's attempt to carry the war into the North was thwarted by Union forces under General George G. Meade. Over 3 days of fighting, the Union Army held firm, repelling Lee's forces and inflicting devastating casualties. The battle resulted in around 51,000 total casualties, making it the bloodiest battle of the war. The Union victory at Gettysburg marked a significant turning point. After this defeat, the Confederacy would never again launch a major offensive into Northern territory. Gettysburg also deprived the Confederacy of much-needed momentum and resources. Lee's retreat back to the South was a blow to Confederate morale, and the Union began to take the initiative in the war. The Battle of Vicksburg, the Union gains control of the Mississippi River. In the West, another critical victory for the Union came at Vicksburg, Mississippi, where General Grant successfully laid siege to the Confederate stronghold from May 18 to July 4, 1863. Vicksburg controlled access to the Mississippi River, a vital transportation and supply route. With the fall of Vicksburg, the Union gained full control of the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy in two and dealing a crushing blow to the South's ability to coordinate its military efforts. The victory at Vicksburg, combined with the triumph at Gettysburg, gave the Union a much-needed boost. The Confederacy, already struggling economically and militarily, now faced a severely weakened position, with the Union Army increasingly gaining ground. The final years, the War of Attrition and Confederate collapse. The final phase of the war was marked by a brutal war of attrition. The Union, under Grant, adopted a strategy of exhausting the Confederate forces by applying constant pressure and cutting off their resources. Battles like the Wilderness Campaign, 1864, and the Siege of Petersburg, 1864-1865, saw tremendous losses on both sides but ultimately wore down the Confederate resistance. By early 1865, the Confederacy was on the brink of collapse. General Lee's army, stretched thin and lacking supplies, was no longer capable of holding off the Union. After months of fighting and a series of defeats, Lee was forced to surrender to Grant at Appomattox Court House on April 9, 1865. The Confederate Army's surrender marked the end of the Civil War. Other Confederate armies soon followed suit, and the United States was finally reunified. The war had cost over 600,000 lives, and its aftermath left the South devastated and the nation deeply divided. The end of the Civil War in 1865 marked a turning point in American history. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the nation began the long, difficult process of rebuilding. However, the aftermath of the war was not only a time of physical reconstruction, but also a period of profound social, political, and economic challenges. The Civil War had fundamentally changed the country, and the question now was, how would the nation rebuild itself? What would life look like for former enslaved people and the Southern states? The abolition of slavery and the 13th Amendment. One of the most significant results of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery. The passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December 1865 legally ended slavery in the United States, except as a punishment for crime. This amendment was a direct consequence of the war and the Emancipation Proclamation, which had paved the way for the legal abolition of slavery in Confederate states. The 13th Amendment was a landmark moment in the struggle for civil rights and marked a significant victory for the abolitionist movement, which had been fighting for decades to end slavery. However, the abolition of slavery did not immediately provide freedom or equality for African Americans. While they were no longer legally bound to work for their former masters, many faced significant challenges in adjusting to their new status as free people. The Southern economy, still heavily reliant on agriculture, had been devastated by the war, and former enslaved people had few resources, no land, and limited opportunities to build new lives. The Reconstruction era rebuilding the South and the nation. The Reconstruction period, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, was the government's attempt to address the social, political, and economic challenges posed by the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. The key goals of Reconstruction were to reintegrate the Southern states into the Union, rebuild the Southern economy, and establish legal and civil rights for newly freed African Americans. President Abraham Lincoln had laid out his vision for Reconstruction in his second inaugural address, where he spoke of malice toward none and charity for all. His plan, which was designed to be lenient toward the Southern states, offered amnesty to those who swore loyalty to the Union and allowed Southern states to rejoin the Union once 10% of their voters pledged allegiance. However, Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865 before he could fully implement his vision. His successor, Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's assassination, took a much more lenient approach toward the South, allowing former Confederate states to rejoin the Union without significant changes to their political structures. Johnson's policies were widely criticized by radical Republicans in Congress, who wanted stricter terms for the South and greater protections for freed slaves. These tensions led to a struggle between Johnson and Congress, culminating in Johnson's impeachment in 1868, though he was acquitted by one vote. In response to Johnson's leniency, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. These acts required the Southern states to rewrite their constitutions, ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to former enslaved people, and hold new elections in which African Americans could vote. The 14th and 15th Amendments, legal protections for African Americans. 2 crucial amendments to the U.S. Constitution were passed during Reconstruction, offering legal protections to African Americans. The 14th Amendment, 1868, guaranteed birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, ensuring that all people born in the United States, including former slaves, were citizens. It also prohibited states from denying any person the equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment, 1870, aimed to secure voting rights for African American men, stating that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was a significant victory for civil rights, but in practice, many Southern states would later find ways to disenfranchise African Americans through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory measures. the rise of black political power, and the Freedmen's Bureau. During Reconstruction, African Americans began to participate actively in political life. In the southern states, African American men voted in large numbers, and many were elected to local, state, and national offices. For the first time in American history, African Americans served as congressmen, senators, and state legislators. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were the first African Americans to serve in the U.S. Senate, representing Mississippi during Reconstruction. At the same time, the Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865 to assist formerly enslaved people and poor whites in the South. The Bureau provided food, clothing, medical care, and education, as well as helping to negotiate labor contracts between former slaves and their employers. It also worked to establish schools for African American children and provided legal assistance. Despite these efforts, the challenges facing African Americans were immense. The South's economy remained largely agrarian, and many former slaves were forced into sharecropping, a system in which they worked land in exchange for a portion of the crops they produced. Unfortunately, sharecropping often trapped African Americans in a cycle of debt and poverty, making it difficult for them to achieve economic independence. The collapse of Reconstruction, the rise of white supremacy. Although Reconstruction achieved significant legal advancements for African Americans, it was not able to fully integrate them into the political and social fabric of the South. As the North's commitment to Reconstruction waned, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from voting, holding office, or exercising their rights. The Klan and other groups terrorized African Americans and white Republicans, undermining the progress made during Reconstruction. In 1876, the contested presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden led to a compromise known as the Compromise of 1877, in which Hayes was awarded the presidency in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This marked the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow era, a period of legalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement that would last for nearly a century. The end of Reconstruction left many of the promises of the Civil War unfulfilled, particularly the full integration of African Americans into American society. While slavery was abolished, African Americans continued to face systemic racism, violence, and political and economic disenfranchisement. The long-term legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Civil War and Reconstruction reshaped the United States in profound ways, but their legacy was complex and incomplete. While slavery was abolished and the Union preserved, many of the racial, political, and economic challenges that were brought to light during the Civil War and Reconstruction persisted for generations. The Civil War's conclusion did not result in immediate equality for African Americans, and the struggle for civil rights would continue throughout the 20th century. The political and legal changes enacted during Reconstruction, such as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, laid the foundation for future civil rights movements, including the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Despite the failure of Reconstruction to fully realize its goals, the war's abolition of slavery and the legal guarantees of civil rights became powerful tools in the fight for justice and equality in the U.S. throughout the next century.